Dr. Stephen Greer, if you don't know who Dr. Greer is, there's a thing that a lot of people are aware of that came out in the internet. It was you on stage introducing this disclosure project, explaining how much information you had access to about alien spacecrafts visiting Earth and how many distinguished, high-ranking military people, one after another, testify that they had personal encounters with things that are not of this world. People who would know the difference between black ops technology, the current military defense projects that might be secret, and people that would know also who to talk to about these things if they did think it was a black ops.
Right.
But they knew.
Right.
And it was, in my opinion, that video is probably one of the most important videos ever when it comes to extraterrestrial life or the idea of extraterrestrial life visiting Earth. Because when you see that video and you see those high-ranking military guys, one after another, give these very not just believable, but they're spooky. These are spooky stories because the way they're talking about them, you could see in their face the emotions as they're recounting the sheer, to use a word, alienness of their experience.
Right.
We had never really seen anything like that before. It had always been, well, I guess they probably could be out there, but who knows? When I watched that video, it was a real shift because it was one of the first things that I ever saw that made me really stop and think. There's a part of everybody that doesn't want to get duped. Right. And when it comes to a subject, especially an important subject like UFOs, there's a part of everybody that goes, you want to call bullshit right away because you don't want to be the last guy to call bullshit. You don't want to be the guy who believes, and it turns it's bullshit. Oh, you dummy. You believed it. You were the first guy believing it, man. You want to be the first guy to call bullshit. It's always a way cooler position. And if there was alien life, that had visited the Earth, what evidence would they leave behind? What would you know in your day-to-day existence? How much of it would you know? Almost nothing.
Nothing. Particularly when it's getting hoovered up by a very well-organized and well-funded intelligence program.
Including the Project Blue Book, which was run by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, right?
Well, that was a cover story. The Project Blue Book was really a little office where they were putting things in there and making it sound like they were really investigating. Meanwhile, there was a unacknowledged project, what we call a black project, but the proper name is an unacknowledged special access project, or USAP. And the USAPs running this have been around since the 40s, very well funded, working on these issues, working on the technologies, studying how these things are going from one star system to another. And that's the sort of thing that we've been drilling down on for about 22 years.
So the Project Blue Book that was run by Dr. Hynek, is that was his name?
Yeah, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, right. He was an Air Force guy, astronomer that the Air Force engaged to do that. And later, he came out and admitted that was all just sort of a dog and pony show.
And he also became a huge UFO believer, which is really fascinating because most of the stories that they investigated in Project Blue Book, he sort of debunked.
Correct.
And in fact, instead of being open about the possibilities, they always steered towards debunking first.
Right. And actually the big problem became when he put his foot in his mouth when in Gerald Ford's home district in Michigan, there were a whole dozens of people who saw an extraterrestrial vehicle that was maneuvering at close range, and he went up and investigated and made some reference to it being swamp gas. And Gerald Ford went ballistic because his constituents went ballistic, and Gerald Ford actually had an inquiry into it while he was a member of the House of Representatives. Of course, later as president, he never dealt with this issue because basically presidential intelligence doesn't have access to those projects.
When you say that he said it was swamp gas, that J. Allen Hynek said it was swamp gas, so right. You're saying that Ford objected because he knew it was an extraterrestrial vehicle?
He knew that some of his constituents who were very credible knew it was something real.
And so he was upset that they were saying that it wasn't a real vehicle. So he clamped down on it.
Yeah, and actually held a hearing where a lot of people came and gave evidence and information, but it didn't go anywhere because it's Washington. Nothing ever goes anywhere in Washington. We began investigating this in 1990. I got involved with this because I knew about it since childhood. I have family. My mom's brother, uncle, was an engineer that worked on the lunar module, and I had an interest in this since I was a little child. So the thing that put Neil Armstrong on the moon, my family had a hand in that. So I think that what most people don't realize is that inside the intelligence community, the aerospace community, there are a lot of people who are very knowledgeable about this, but they're not allowed to talk about it. It's a career ender for most of them. And that was what we did for Disclosure Project, was to put all those folks together, identify them. So I spent about 10 years identifying who these people were. And first I had maybe half a dozen of them. Now we have over 500. You know, these witnesses that we have who are military go from the head of investigations for the FAA, John Callahan, to people like Gordon Cooper, who was one of the early Mercury astronauts who his crew actually filmed one of these extraterrestrial vehicles landing on a dry lake bed out here near Edwards, and he looked at the film and sent it on a Pentagon plane. Gordon Cooper, you know, very heroic early astronaut, had detailed information, what we call actionable intelligence, on that event, this landing of a vehicle in broad daylight near Edwards Air Force Base in 1956. Now, when Clinton was president, Gordon Cooper was asked by the Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, about this issue. And he says, yes, I absolutely will verify this, and I'll give you the information of when and where and how it happened. So the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America had this information, made an inquiry through channels, and came up with a dry hole. Basically, this stuff has all been put into a parallel universe that the senior people in our government have, for the most part, no access to. Now, I would not have believed that if I hadn't been the guy who was brought to Washington during the Clinton years to do the briefing for the CIA director. And I was asked to go up there, and I put together a whole lot of these early witnesses' testimony, photographs, some really amazing government documents that we acquired. And I put this briefing together. And so I go up there, and here's the sitting CIA director, R. James Woolsey. His wife was there, who was at the time the chief operating officer of the National Academy of Sciences. And when I was first invited to go up there and brief the CIA director, I was told, they want you to come up here because President Clinton and he have inquired about this subject and are being denied access. Now, I have a letter proving this. The CIA director's handler who contacted me said, look, they need you to come up here because they can't find out anything, but they know stuff's going on. Well, I thought they just wanted to pick my brain as sort of spooks. You know how spooks, spies will try to just get information. I went up there, and the CIA director was honestly completely in the dark. And I was mortified. And towards the end of this almost 3-hour briefing that I did for the CIA director, my wife was with me, and I gave him this white paper, this position paper, that a summary of action that the president needed to take and he needed to take. And, you know, at the end of it, I said, you know, we really need you to help disclose this information because the people need to know, but also the technologies that we've studied and have mastered for 50 years could get us off oil. We could fix this environment. We could fix the world's poverty problems and the geopolitical problems in the Middle East. And he looked at me, he says, how do we disclose that which we have no access to? And I thought I'd pass out. I said, what do you mean you have no access? And this was from his mouth to my ears. And so I learned the hard way, the very, very hard way, that when you're dealing with things that are, some people say above top secret, but the proper name is an unacknowledged special access project. And we have about $100 to $200 billion a year in our treasury going into these rogue operations. And it's a criminal. It's outrageous that, you know, just because you're the CIA director, just because you're Secretary of Defense or on the Senate Intelligence Committee means nothing. And even the president. So the reason those folks invited me to come up there is that the year before, I had taken a team of people out on a beach using some experimental protocols to contact these vehicles and the occupants. And 4 of these UFOs popped into the sky, just boom, 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 which we have on videotape. Not great videotape because we didn't have good cameras back then. And there were a couple Air Force officers and pilots there. And this went up through the chain of command. A few months later, the former head of Army Intelligence invites me to a meeting, and then some National Security Agency people do, and one thing leads to another, and I'm being invited to brief the sitting CIA director. So that's, you know,
how did you contacted these spaceships?
Yes, and
you can do that at any time.
Well, not at any time, but I think that under the right,
you can do that.
There are protocols, and we developed something called the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind Initiative, which is when you use a set of they're very controversial protocols that deal with non-locality, the fact that the universe has various dimensions that you can move through to go from one star system to another. But those dimensions that are at higher resonant fields than, say, linear space-time or electromagnetism also interface with what I call coherent thought. So the Moody Blues were right when they said thinking is the best way to travel. And there's a component to where I'm probably going to lose half your listeners right now.
No, you won't. I've got freaks listening.
All right, well, okay,
right
all you freaks, listen up and listen up hard. You can develop technologies, and we have these in classified projects now, where you can have what's called a switch that will interface with very intent thought. So it's beyond, forget your iPhone. Now, if you're traveling from one star system to another, that's what you're going to be using. You're going to be using technologies that are phasing at multiples of the speed of light. And those dimensions also intersect at a certain point with coherent thought, just like light is coherent, a laser is coherent light. And so this gets into the whole question of how over the history of humanity have there been so many reports of contact, and there are. I mean, going all the way back to the Vimanas and the Vedas to accounts that, there's a wonderful painting in the Middle Ages of this exactly, it looks like a modern UFO over the shoulder of Mary, holding Jesus in a picture it's from the 1400s. I've actually seen the original of this. So I think the question becomes, we probably have always had extraterrestrial civilizations observing our little planet. The question is, what happened in the last 50 to 100 years that really got their attention? And I'm quite convinced it was when we started detonating thermonuclear weapons. But one of the projects we're involved with is Disclosure Project. Another one is sort of a citizens diplomacy effort saying, look, since our government is dead in the water on this in terms of the Secretary of State and folks like that, so I started a citizens diplomacy effort back in 1990.
The idea that coherent thought, as you say, intersects with these other levels, these other dimensions that we can't normally access.
Correct.
How did you find out about this, and how did you develop the ability
Well, you're
to
putting me in the hot seat early, man.
Well, you have to. When you say that you can do that, I mean, somehow or another, you have to, without getting anybody killed, you have to explain. How'd you figure that out?
I figured it out when I was a teenager through a series of experiences I had. I had a near-death experience when I was 17. I was very sick. And I had an experience that took me into some awareness about the nature of consciousness and the non-locality of mind. And the fact that the mind is actually a singularity, that there's really only one mind. And it's just shining through various individuals, appearing as many. And this experience, although it sounds very spiritual and religious, was very palpable. And I was raised a very devout atheist, so we didn't believe in anything. And so when I realized that this was real, I began to study meditation. And through that began to have some experiences where I realized this could happen. And I had a contact experience. I was 18, it was a few months later, in the fall of 1973. And I was doing this, I was meditating, and then I was doing what's now called SRV, scientific remote viewing, where you use consciousness to see remote places. And of course, Army intelligence and the CIA have experimented with this for years, which you may or may not know about. We can get into that. But I know all those guys. I know all the SRV people. But I was a kid, and I just turned 18. I was doing this, and suddenly I had this experience where I thought, well, what if I try to go into that state of one mind that I experienced when I was a kid, 6 months earlier when I had this near-death experience? So I did. And then I had an experience where I remote viewed and saw deep space and could see that there was an ET spacecraft out there. And I made contact, and it appeared. And it literally materialized right near the mountain where I was.
And how old were you when you did this?
18.
No drugs?
No, I've never done any drugs, actually.
You've never done any drugs?
No.
No psychedelics, nothing?
Never.
Wow.
No.
Are you aware of dimethyltryptamine? Do you know what that is?
Yeah, I do.
You know, it's supposedly your brain produces it
Right.
when you're in periods of extreme stress or near-death experiences.
Yeah.
And it's also the same chemical that's in ayahuasca.